Here we go. Hello, and welcome to this webinar on the 2025 CLF North American Material Baselines Report. We appreciate you coming. First, I want to introduce our small but mighty low-carbon products team here at CLF. I'm Brooke Waldman. I manage the 2025 CLF Baselines project. Rochelle Habchi was the other core project team member. She'll also be presenting with me today. Jordan Palmieri served as our project technical advisor and also managed the previous Material Baselines project. He's here today and may help with the Q&A. Some other important people to mention: Megan Byrne, CLF's Engagement and Communications Lead, is here. And I want to give a shout out to the University of Washington Lifecycle Lab staff who supported this project in various ways, especially Kate Simonen, Milad Ashtiani, and Monica Huang. So first, while we're getting warmed up, a question to you all, the audience. Please introduce yourself in the chat. Your name, your work, location, any brief other things you want to share. And while we do that, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. So we will post a recording of this webinar afterwards. For any questions about content that you want to direct to CLF staff, please use the Zoom's Q&A function. And staff will reply by typing responses back in the Q&A, in some cases responding verbally at the end of the session. And for any questions we don't get to, we'll provide written responses to share afterwards. We'll pose a few more questions to the audience, like this initial one during the webinar, and so we ask that you respond in the chat to those for everyone to see. So today, Rochelle and I will give some background and provide an overview of the project. We'll dive into the report and discuss some of the methods and results and highlight examples. We're going to focus more on what's new for this 2025 version. So if you're not familiar with the previous CLF Material Baselines reports, it might be helpful for you to also watch a recording of our webinar from 2023. And we'll have some time for questions at the end. To get us started, I'll take us on a brief trip down memory lane. CLF developed the first material baselines in 2019. That was to explicitly support the EC3 tool. We've published major versions roughly every 2 years since then. I've personally had a hand in all of these, including the 2025 Material Baselines report that we published just this past June. Some things have changed over time. It's grown dramatically, both in depth and in breadth, from just a few pages back in 2019 to roughly 200 pages, this most recent version. We've added a lot more information and documentation along the way, and it's evolved to serve some more uses over time. At the same time, I'd say the core objectives have remained mostly consistent, providing a snapshot of embodied carbon data for North American construction materials. So what does the report provide? First and foremost, it provides a set of CLF baseline global warming potential, or GWP, values. So these are estimates of industry average greenhouse gas emissions for construction materials in North America. Their primary use is to serve as a basis of comparison. So for people to compare to specific products against these baseline numbers for lead and policy and project specifications, etc. And they can also serve as default or generic embodied carbon intensity values in whole building LCA or other project scale modeling. So if you don't know what particular product you're going to use in a project, or you don't have embodied carbon data on that particular product, you could use these industry average values as data sources to plug into your model. Each baseline value is for some product type, like clay brick in the screenshot, and the value is a GWP number in kilograms of CO2 equivalent. We'll get into more of those. The report also provides a state of EPD's snapshot, including category background information and an analysis of the current EPD data in terms of counts, embodied carbon ranges, locations, etc. And the report includes a supporting methodology. So this is to provide our audience transparency about our process and also to provide a model for others to use and adapt and build on for their own needs. So if someone's developing something similar in other locations or other materials or a particular program, they could build on this method, we hope. So that was generally what the report provides. I'll take a moment to orient you a bit to its organization. I'll highlight a few items from the table of contents here. The executive summary includes tables of all the baseline values and brief supporting notes and references. And then section 3, results by category, provides that state of EPDs I was talking about with the product type descriptions, EPD counts and statistics, and full documentation for all baseline values. So these results by category correspond to what were the category appendices in 2023. So note that for the 2023 baselines, we published 2 documents. That was a smaller report and then a much larger document of category appendices. This 2025 version, we combined all this information to 1 document. And then the methods section, that documents our approach to a range of topics that we'll discuss today. And then separate from the PDF report, we also have an Excel file with all the baseline values and supporting documentation. So you could sort, filter, copy and paste, etc. And you can download that Excel file from the project webpage. It's the orange button that says Table of Values. Okay, what's new? So I mentioned how the project has evolved and grown over time between versions. Here's a little bit of what's new in this 2025 version. First are some behind the scenes changes to our process, and these aren't necessarily evident if you're reading the document, but it was really important for our efforts. And that was that we were more intentional about doing a lot more stakeholder engagement this time. So we reached out to many, many industry associations and manufacturers. Many gave us valuable input and feedback, and we really appreciate that expert perspective. Thank you to those of you on the call today that are in that group. We also sent out a user feedback survey last year to hear more from readers about what they found helpful or what was missing from the last version of the project. A small group of independent experts reviewed a draft of our methods. This included people with expertise in LCA and policy, and construction and procurement, EPDs, design, and whole building LCA. And finally, we coordinated with Building Transparency. That's the organization that operates the EC3 tool. We worked with them to collect our data from the EC3 database, and we're working with them now to incorporate the new baseline values into the EC3 tool. In terms of our methods, some items here we were already doing in previous versions, and this time around we put more effort into refining those methods and also providing more documentation, and others are more new to this version. So we'll get into all these today in the webinar. Classifying product types for appropriate comparisons, parent and child category baselines, that's new this version. User calculated baselines, mostly new this version. Our approach to QAing the data, how we assess data source representativeness, that is how well it reflects the overall industry, and then how we set baseline values. And then finally, lots of new content. So that means updating our baseline values and the state of EPD snapshot to reflect all the things that have changed in the last 2 years. And we've added a whole bunch of new categories and additional baseline values, which Rochelle will discuss in a moment. Appendix A in the report provides a lot more information on changes between the 2023 version and this 2025 version. So now I'm going to hand it over to Rochelle. She'll talk a bit about how the baselines are used and then get into the report.
Thanks, Brooke. So there are many different use and application of baselines in the industry, and there are many different parts of the industry that use baselines, and that ranges from designers, owners, building rating systems, and policymakers. Personally, for me, when I was previously a practicing structural engineer, we used the material baselines to coordinate with sustainability consultants to comply with city requirements. Like, for example, some of my projects were located in Vancouver, so it would have been the City of Vancouver's whole building LCA requirements, which was the first in North America. We also use the baseline values to create embedded GWP calculators in our design spreadsheets to understand the implications of our design changes as we were designing and revising the design of the structural elements. In the building rating systems world, the new LEED V5 has a credit for assessing and quantifying embodied carbon, and that references the CLF baselines for project teams to use. And there's carbon assessment tools like EC3 and OneClick's free planetary tool that also incorporates CLF's material baseline values as references. Additionally, the baseline values help to inform policies related to low carbon procurement and specification, which I think is very useful for policymakers when trying to set codified limits. All right, and so we wanted to know how do you all use the material baselines report? And we'll take a couple seconds right now to give you all a chance to type in your responses in the chat.
Hey, and just a heads up to everybody, I think we do not have access to the chat button right now, but we do have access to Q&A. So if you all want to type your answers into Q&A, I will do my best to help sort people's answers versus people's actual questions for the presenters. So sorry about that. Chat function doesn't seem to be showing up, but we will manage it on our end as best as possible. Thanks.
Okay. Um, all right, so we'll take a step inside the report. We're going to take a closer look at our methods, how we analyze the results, and how we provided additional information on how you might interpret the baseline values and be able to use that information effectively and accurately. Environmental product declarations are the main data sources that were used for publishing CLF baseline values. And a quick reminder, an environmental product declaration, which is also known as an EPD, are third-party verified documents that report the environmental impacts, one of them being global warming potential, of a particular product. They are often compared to nutrition labels, which is why we added this nutrition label to the side, in that they provide the required information of impacts for a given product. There are industry average APDs. They are usually published by industry associations and tend to be weighted by production. And then there are manufacturer and or facility specific EPDs that are also called product EPDs and are for a specific product that is created. So, what kind of data did we use for the baselines report? We collected our EPDs mostly from the EC3 database, and the scope of the project was designated as follows. Our main analysis and baseline values cover lifecycle modules A1 through A3, which is also called the product stage or cradle to gate, and it includes the production and transport of raw materials and the manufacturing of the construction product. EPDs for some categories we want to note like cover additional life cycle stages such as installation, use, and end of life, and we provide some of that supplementary information for those specific materials. But generally, the main focus for the report is A1 through A3 emissions. Geographically, we've narrowed down our geographical scope to EPDs manufactured specifically in North America, which includes Canada, the US, and Mexico. And as previously mentioned, EPDs report results for many environmental impact categories, but our primary focus here is climate change, which is reported as global warming potential, or known as GWP. So in determining whether or not we want to include a certain category or product type, we take a look at three things, and that's function, PCR, and EPD data availability. And just to clarify, all three things may be met for a particular product, and if so, we would usually decide to include that category as a section in our report and analyze the EPD data. But that does not necessarily mean that we would feel comfortable enough to set a CLF baseline value. So setting a CLF baseline value depends on additional criteria, such as representative assessment, which we'll get to later on. In terms of appropriate function, we ask ourselves, is it a construction product category or type that is typically used in either a building structure enclosure and or finishes, or is used in major elements in roadways or other transportation For appropriate PCR, first I just want to uh, take a moment to say, like, what are PCRs? They're comprehensive guidelines that design the specific rules, requirements, and methods for conducting an LCA and creating an EPD for a particular product category. So, for example, concrete has its own PCR, steel has its own PCR, and so on. And for PCRs, we ask ourselves, is there a valid North American PCR that covers that category or product type? In terms of EPD data availability, we asked the question, is there an applicable industry average EPD that is valid, manufactured in North America, and follows a current PCR? Or is there a collection of, in lieu of that, is there a collection of applicable product EPDs that are valid, manufactured in North America, and follow a current PCR? Within product categories that meet that main criteria, CLF prioritizes categories that meet these additional criteria, and that is GWP significance and or stakeholder demand. So that's really, we ask ourselves, how relevant and useful is it to the industry? We want to make sure that it's also relatively free of comparability issues and that it is or falls within a public EC3 category. So CLF uses judgment in applying these guidelines. Other factors not listed above include staff time availability and knowledge. So there may be cases where a product type may meet the above criteria, but it's just excluded from the report. For the 2025 baselines, we really wanted to put an emphasis on filling in the gap for product types that were not designated, that didn't have designated baseline values in the 2023 baselines report. And really, that was because we wanted to provide a more robust document for the industry. And we're really excited and happy about the end product that we were able to produce. This is a graphic showing all the new categories and new baselines that were provided in 2025. And in 2023, just for reference, there was 61 non-concrete and non-asphalt baselines. And in 2025, we now have 157 non-concrete and non-asphalt baselines. So that represents about a 250 increase in that category. We had 198 concrete baselines, and now we have 218 concrete baselines. And we didn't have any asphalt baseline values in 2023, and now we have 124 asphalt baseline values. So really, it represents it altogether represents a 200% increase in or 100% increase or 2x in the number of baseline values provided. For each category and product type, we included a section in the report that is meant to encapsulate all the additional information that is super interesting and informative and provide a greater context for EPD availability and GWP variability for that specific material category. So we included a category description, which includes how the product is typically produced, specifically with regards to North America, what product types are covered, and notes on PCR and declared unit. We also include GWP contribution by life cycle stage through a bar chart, which you see here. And we also provide the spread of GWP results across our data set of EPDs, and that's represented as a dot plot and a table, which you see on the right-hand side of up here, and a map that designates where all the facilities with the EPDs are located. In this report, we just want to make mention that we refer to industry average EPDs as industry EPDs, and we refer to EPDs made by one manufacturer as product EPDs. And each section of the category results also includes all of the baseline values for that category, along with full documentation of our data sources, methods, calculations, and notes about using the baselines. In this version of the baselines, we've included a QA intensity indicator for each product type baseline value. And in this QA intensity indicator, we check to make sure that the digitized data matches the original EPDs, typically PDFs for most categories. For many product types that have tens of thousands or thousands of data points, we look at a fraction of that data set. In order to decide where to focus our efforts, we first looked at whether the category's product EPD was especially significant for our project, meaning that it was especially important for us to have a reliable, accurate data set. And we determined this based on these two criteria. If the category is a major focus in Buy Clean policies, starting with EPA's 4 key materials, or if we anticipated using the collection of product EPDs for calculating a baseline. If it was one of these two things, that's how we prioritized and did a more intensive QA for the product type. Next, we looked at the number of EPDs. Where there are relatively few EPDs, we manually reviewed most or all of them. And where there are relatively many EPDs, we manually reviewed a sample which was different from product to product type. For all categories, we did at least these basic data preparation steps. So we ensured that the data set contained appropriate and coordinated units. We excluded duplicates and filtered out the EPDs that were outdated, manufactured outside of North America, and used improper PCRs. Even for the low QA intensity product types, we made sure to manually spot check EPDs in the dataset to be more comfortable with the data presented. So we were especially careful at looking at high and low outliers in order to determine whether they truly were outliers or if they just weren't supposed to be a part of the dataset. Where we designated intensity level of low, we performed only those basic cleaning and QA steps that I just mentioned, so we're generally less confident about the dataset for these categories compared to others. Where we designate an intensity level of medium, what we mean is that this reflects a good confidence on CLF's part with respect to the data results presented, but that there may be additional QA required. We manually reviewed some portion of the EPDs to check for appropriate PCR, product type, GWP value, units, etc. And when we designate an intensity level of high, what we mean is that this reflects a high confidence on CLF's part with respect to the data results presented. So we reviewed a vast majority, if not all, the EPDs available in the dataset for that particular product type. And now I'd like to pass it off to Brooke, who will go into our methods for classifying products and comparability and categorization.
Almost forgot to unmute myself. Thanks, Rochelle. Um, well, okay, classifying products. So I mentioned we publish a baseline value for a given product type, but how do we determine what that product type is? Like what it does and doesn't include? It's a simple question, but often not a simple answer. Sometimes this is the thing we scratched our head and discussed and sometimes debated the most. So we developed some basic principles for an approach. And reminder that our primary goal is to develop baselines that are to be used as a basis of comparison for comparing GWP values, like between an EPD for a particular product and a baseline. And so our approach to categorization needed to support that goal. So for our purposes of setting baselines that support product comparisons, we classify product types primarily on functional equivalence. Because if you're comparing different products to a baseline value or products to products, we strive for apples to apples comparisons to the extent possible. So we group together products that are generally functionally equivalent, what we sometimes call swappable with each other, ones that could reasonably serve the same function in a project and be directly swapped one for another. And we classify products using attributes that affect both A, functional performance, and B, GWP per declared unit. So by attribute, I mean some way you might sort or distinguish products. So for people, that might mean age or hair color or occupation. For construction products, we're looking at attributes that affect functional performance like compressive strength or R value or thickness. And we want attributes that are relevant to global warming potential, to embodied carbon, because that's the metric we're looking at in this project. So we're looking for attributes that affect both of these things, performance or swappability and GWP per declared unit. So here's an example, XPS foam board insulation. It's made in different compressive strengths. So let's consider for the category of XPS foam board insulation, the attribute of compressive strength and whether or not we should use it to define different baseline product types within XPS. So does compressive strength affect functional performance? Yes. Different strengths are appropriate for different applications. You likely can't swap a 25 PSI product if the specification calls for a 60 PSI product. And Does compressive strength affect GWP per declared unit? Yes, the data we have show that the XPS's GWP correlates very strongly with the compressive strength. So therefore, yes, this attribute of compressive strength is relevant for defining XPS product types. And so we have separate baseline values for XPS for different compressive strengths. We could say the same about concrete and compressive strength. That's why there are different CLF baselines for concrete by different strengths. A different example, rebar comes in different diameters. Should the attribute of diameter be used to define different rebar baseline product types? Well, does rebar diameter affect functional performance? Yes. Half-inch diameter rebar is not necessarily functionally equivalent, not directly swappable with three-quarter-inch diameter rebar. But does diameter affect GWP per declared unit? No. Rebar EPDs report impacts per ton. So a ton of half-inch rebar will have the same or virtually the same GWP as a ton of three-quarter-inch rebar. So therefore, for our purposes, diameter is not a relevant attribute for setting baselines. So we have a baseline for rebar of all sizes, not separate baselines for different diameters. Another similar example would be dimensional lumber, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x12s. They're not directly swappable, not necessarily functionally equivalent, but because they have the same GWP per declared unit, they're measured in a cubic meter, we can ignore dimension for the purpose of setting baselines for lumber. Another aspect of functional equivalence and swappability can be location. Because for some categories, where you are geographically really defines the basket of potential products you could source. You might buy a window from halfway around the world, but you're going to source concrete or asphalt mixtures from pretty close by. So for product types like that with local or regional distribution rather than national or international distribution, we consider attributes that might affect availability and GWP. And in those cases, and where we have the data, we provide regional rather than, or sometimes in addition to, North America baselines. So for example, ready-mix concrete, consider geographic region as an attribute of ready-mix concrete that we could potentially use to define ready-mix baseline product types. Is concrete regionally distributed? Yes, concrete doesn't travel very far. If I'm in the Pacific Northwest, which I am, I can't swap in a concrete mix from Georgia because it has a better embodied carbon value. And does geographic location affect GWP? Yes. So due to the different aggregates and other ingredients available by region, mixes of the same strength class in one region compared to another often have different embodied carbon, different GWP per declared unit. So the attribute of geographic region is relevant for defining ready-mix baseline product types. And we follow the NRMCA, that's the US National Ready-Mix Concrete Association, and Canadian Ready-Mix Concrete Associations, who all publish values by different geographies, and we publish concrete baselines by region in addition to by strength. A similar example is concrete masonry unit, or CMU. CMU is heavy and not reasonably transported long distances. Similar to ready-mix concrete, CMU producers in different regions have access to different ingredients, different aggregates and cements that affect GWP. So in alignment with the CMU industry average EPDs, we have different CMU baselines based on different ingredients whose availability varies by region. So, something new for the 2025 baselines is what we call parent and child category baselines. So here's the idea. As I said before, we categorize baseline product types by functional equivalence. But functional equivalence is not inherent to a product or material. It depends in part on the particular application. So that's the criteria, the needs of a particular project. There are many cases of similar products that are sometimes functionally equivalent and sometimes not, depending on the application. So, for example, we see two different types of wood sheathing here. Softwood plywood in the upper right, oriented strand board, or OSB, on the bottom. In many cases, either of these children, plywood or OSB, can serve the function of sheathing in a building envelope. In some cases, though, there are particular performance requirements for a given project that make it so that only one or the other is a reasonable option for a given project and not both. So often swappable, sometimes not swappable. And in some of these cases, depending on if we have the data, CLF provided separate baseline values for both child and parent level product types. And this is what it looks like in a section of the report. So here we see baseline values for each of these child categories, softwood, plywood, and OSB. So separate product types, separate baseline values. And then we also see a single baseline for the parent category of wood sheathing, which is also called out in the documentation. We do recognize that this can add a layer of confusion to the question of which baseline do I use, the plywood baseline or the wood sheathing baseline? So we do provide some guidance. For the typical use case of baseline as a comparison point, if only one of the child product types can fulfill the project requirements, we recommend using that child baseline value. So if the particular project requires plywood for its sheathing, then it makes sense to use that plywood baseline. If multiple child product types could fulfill the project requirements, then it might make sense to use the parent category baseline to represent that broader collection of potential products that could be used. So if both OSB and plywood could fulfill a project's sheathing requirements, it may be appropriate to use the parent wood sheathing baseline. There's a bit more nuance in the report for cases where baselines are used as generic or default embodied carbon values. But this is the main approach in terms of the guidance. Okay, how do we set baseline values? We outlined 4 steps. Step 1, identify the data source. So we're identifying a potential data source to use, and that's either existing published industry-wide data, typically an industry average EPD or industry average LCA report or industry benchmark report, or it's a collection of manufacturer-specific EPDs. Again, we refer to those here as product EPDs. We prioritize industry-wide data sources because they're already published values developed by industry associations using data collected from several participating manufacturers. They tend to cover a large share of the market and are typically production weighted. But we don't always have those. We'll get to that. So the data source is based on some portion of the overall market. And if we're going to set a baseline value that we want to represent the whole market, we want to be confident that this sample, our data source, reasonably reflects or represents the overall industry. So after identifying a potential data source, we assess its representativeness of the overall industry. Bear with me as I go into ISO land for a moment. So this is how the ISO standards for LCA define representativeness: a qualitative assessment of the degree to which the data set reflects the true population of interest. So in our case, that true population of interest is the overall industry for that product type, in terms of geographical coverage, time period, and technology coverage. So we use this ISO definition to guide us here. And we use a few different approaches that build on it depending on the data source. The industry data approach. So industry average EPDs, they're already required to follow ISO and EPD standards for representativeness for their scope. So this first approach, what we call the industry data approach, is a kind of a shortcut. If it's a published industry-wide data source that has already demonstrated conformance to those ISO requirements, and we don't see any red flags, then we assume that the EPD, or sometimes LCA or benchmark report, is sufficiently representative. The other 2 approaches here are for collections of product EPDs. So the sampling fraction approach, it's also a kind of a shortcut. So in statistics terms, the sampling fraction is how large the sample is relative to the overall population. So in our case, the EPDs we have, that's our sample. And if those constitute a large majority of the total industry in terms of production volume or in terms of number of plants, then we can be pretty confident that our data source, that collection of EPDs, sufficiently represents the overall industry. And then finally, the qualitative approach. So if we can't use either of those shortcuts, we don't have industry-wide data and we don't have a really large sample, then we use the qualitative approach. And in those cases, CLF looked at each of those factors, each of ISO's factors there on the right, of geography, time, and technology, and we qualitatively assessed each to determine if the collection of EPDs sufficiently reflected the overall industry. So we'll get into a few examples of this. Production volume data. So if there's multiple data points that we're going to average together, we look for production volume data so we can calculate a weighted average, as a weighted average is generally a more accurate representation than a straight or unweighted average. Spoiler alert, we almost never had this production data, but we hope to in the future. And finally, we set a baseline value using an applicable method. So these are the terms we've given to our 5 basic methods. The industry or product refers to the type of data source. Single, that first one means it was a single industry-wide data point, and we use that value as the CLF baseline. The ones that say weighted means we calculated a weighted average, and the ones that say unweighted, that's where we didn't have production data, so we performed a straight unweighted average, acknowledging some limitations to that approach. These orange numbers are the portion of baselines we published this year using each of these methods. So as you can see, the vast majority are values taken from existing published industry-wide EPDs, LCA reports, benchmark reports. And I'll note within that 90%, similar to what Rochelle mentioned earlier about our total counts, the majority are for ready-mix concrete and asphalt mixtures. This is a decision tree graphic from the report. Here we see the upper half that focuses on industry-wide data sources, and along the top are those 4 steps I just mentioned. As I mentioned before, we prioritizing using industry data sources since they typically cover a representative sample and are production weighted. So using this chart, we'll go through one example of hot rolled structural steel sections. So step 1, we asked, is there an existing industry-wide data point for hot rolled structural sections? Yes, there's a recently published industry average LCA report produced by the AISC, American Institute of Steel Construction. Step 2, is the data source sufficiently representative of the industry? Yes, the LCA report aligns with CLF's scope for this category and it follows ISO's representativeness requirements. So we do consider it sufficiently representative of the industry. Step 3, production weighting data. We skip the step. That's because we're using a single data point in this case. So CLF doesn't need to do any of our own calculations. So not relevant here. But I should mention that the LCA report's results are production weighted, as is true for most industry average LCAs and EPDs. And then finally, 4, applicable baseline method. So in this case, it's the straightforward method of industry because we used industry-wide data, and single because it's a single data point. So for this method, we simply used the published GWP result from the industry LCA report for structural sections as our CLF baseline value. Now we'll look a bit about when we used product EPDs as our data source. We did more of this version. So in 2023, we used product EPD data to set baselines for only one category, XPS installation. As you can see, there's a bigger list this version. And as I said, I've said a few times, we prioritize using industry average EPDs for setting baselines where possible. But we have heard a lot of demand for providing baselines for other product types, ones that don't have any published industry-wide data. And so we have moved towards providing more baselines using the product method where we have sufficient data. So we do acknowledge the limitations, especially the lack of production weighting, but also think there's value in providing something for people to use if we have decent data, even if it's not perfect. This lower portion of that decision tree graphic focuses on when we use product TPDs as our data source. I'll go through an example. So we'll look at the example of cross-laminated timber, CLT. Step one, data source. Well, we don't see the upper portion of the decision tree here. It was cropped out to fit on the screen, but that was where we checked if there was existing already published industry-wide data. And there is no industry average EPD or other published industry-wide data that covers all North American CLT. But there is a collection of product EPDs for CLT. So that is our potential data source, a collection of product EPDs. Step two, assessing their representativeness. So is the sampling fraction large enough? Our threshold is 80%. Yes, in fact, every one of the, I think, dozen or so CLT manufacturing plants in North America that we are aware of has a published EPD. And all but one of those use the applicable North American PCR. So therefore, our sampling fraction is over 80%. And so we assume that the collection of EPDs is sufficiently representative of the industry. It sufficiently reflects the overall industry in terms of geography, technology, time. Step three, are production weighting data available? Short answer is no. We looked into alternative ways of weighting it, but none came up that seemed sufficient for our purposes. Manufacturers generally do not share production volume data, which is understandable. So step three is no. And step four, calculating the baseline. So the method is product because we're using product EPDs, and unweighted because we calculated a straight rather than a weighted average of the available EPDs and set the baseline as that average. As Rochelle mentioned earlier, all of this, our data sources, our representativeness assessments, our calculations, it's all documented in the category results sections. So you can see our process there. And speaking of Rochelle, I'm going to pass it back over to you now, Rochelle.
Thanks. Yeah, so a lot of our categories, they can be separated into discrete product types. For example, within loose fill insulation, there are discrete product types of fiberglass, mineral wool, and cellulose. However, there are some cases where there is a continuous range of potential products that vary in functional performance and GWP. An example of that includes insulated metal panels and their varying thicknesses, or wood I-joists and their varying depths. And so in those cases, we look to use user-calculated baseline values to calculate more specific GWP values. So with insulated metal panels, there are many different thicknesses, as shown in the screenshot. The different thicknesses affects the panel's functional performance and its GWP per declared unit of 100 square meters. Another example, there are countless potential asphalt mixtures, each designed to meet certain local conditions and project needs. So again, the different mix designs affect both performance and GWP. So in these cases, a single discrete baseline value for insulated metal panel or asphalt mixtures, or even a few discrete baseline values can't really capture the nuance. And so where it made sense, we provided the tools for user-calculated baseline values. For these user-calculated values, CLF provides an equation, and the user can input the particular variables. So the user can get a baseline for a given thickness of insulated metal panel, or a baseline for a given asphalt mixture in a given location. This is a snapshot showing the formula a user can use to calculate the associated GWP value of an insulated metal panel for a certain panel thickness. It's designated as T, which makes it really easy to provide a more accurate GWP. And a question to the audience that if you could answer in the Q&A, what do you feel are the most important or most helpful baseline values or any new updates to the 2025 baselines report? And we'll give you guys 10 to 15 seconds to answer.
And I'll take this moment to apologize that we don't have the chat.
Yeah.
That out. A couple more seconds.
Okay. Feel free to continue responding in the Q&A. But I'm going to talk a bit about our appendices. So we have three appendices in this version of the baselines report. The first details revisions that we've made this time around when compared to the 2023 baselines. The second details our processes surrounding data collection and cleaning. And the third compares baseline values changes from 2023 to 2025. Appendix A goes into detail about the process and the methods surrounding how the CLF baseline values were documented and adopted, which is what we've gone into depth throughout this webinar. If you'd like more information, we encourage you to go check out Appendix A in the report. And then, as mentioned, Appendix B goes more into depth about data collection, data cleaning, and how we designate QA intensity levels for different material products. And if you'd like more information about that, it can be found in Appendix B in the report. And Appendix C, I think these tables are super helpful, at least for me, and I hope for everybody else reading this. But Appendix C compares the baseline values of all the product types we had in 2023 to the baseline values in 2025. And in general, obviously, we want to see these baseline values decrease over time, and we do see that with some values here, but not all. In some cases, we don't see changes because we're using industry average data, and it's the same from 2023 and these types of assessments don't change over 5 years. But specifically, sometimes in conversations that we've had with industries like AISC is like the only industry where they've seen these values decrease over time. And our last question to the audience, obviously a huge motivation to create this report is for people to use it and for everybody in the industry to use it and for it to be helpful and useful. So we really would love some feedback on what you would like to see personally in the next version of the material baselines report. I think it'd be super helpful. And we'll give you time to respond in the Q&A. And feel free to continue responding in the Q&A if you'd like, if you need a bit more time. And then if you don't get to respond in the Q&A, please feel free to reach out to Brooke and I. Our emails are on displayed here. If you have any additional questions, comments, or suggestions, we're super open to that. And thank you for listening to us.
Yeah, thank you so much. So again, we'll have a recording posted. We'll send up a follow-up with our contact information and other information. And I'm gonna ask Jordan to uh, give us some questions.
Great. Thank you both, Brooke and Rochelle. I encourage everybody to please continue listing any questions that you have in the Q&A function, and I will do my best to sort through them and see which ones we can answer live. We still have about 10 minutes left in the webinar, so we hope to get to at least some of these questions live. All right. So the first one, just warming up. This is an easy one, Brooke. This is from Mary. Will CLF continue to update the baselines report on a regular schedule, or will timeline for future updates be announced on the website?
Well, our intention and plan is to continue to publish roughly every 2 years as we have in the past. We'll certainly let folks know if that changes, but that's our intention right now.
Absolutely, yeah. If as long as we have funding available to continue to fund this project, a 2 year on every 2 year basis is our intent. Um, okay, I think the next one I'm gonna tee up is about industry average EPDs. The question is, when using industry average EPDs, how are these vetted? And did you compare a spread of product-specific EPDs to the industry average to see how the industry GWP values compare to the average GWP of what's available on the market plus what's in the EC3 tool?
Hmm. I'm going to see if I can do this. Go back to one of Rochelle's slides that has an image of this. Um, pardon my, pardon my, okay. Um, so there are a few parts. I might need you to remind me, Jordan, but do we vet them? Um, actually, this one's a little bigger. Um, Yes, we don't necessarily we can't validate all their data, but we do look at their the information they provide on the representativeness of the industry. So they all provide that information, and we document key points in our category results. The so we share what was from the industry EPD related to its representativeness of the industry. And there was a question about comparing the industry EPD to the collection of product EPDs. So here on the top, the dot plot, I realize it's not super big, but the orange diamonds are industry average EPDs and the blue dots are product EPDs. And this is GWP along the x-axis. So there are cases like this that we see for mineral blanket where the industry EPD is kind of at one end of the spectrum, at one end of the range. We see other cases where it's somewhere in the middle, like this example for fiberglass. That's an interesting question that we try and unearth a little bit about why it might be one or the other. Was there more to that that I haven't gotten to, Jordan?
Yeah, do we compare a spread of product specific to the industry average? So yes, we do. You just showed the chart. And I think one more important point to add here is that, one of the values of using industry average EPDs is that they are production weighted. So that when we use that average value, we know it's weighted by the production volumes that each manufacturer is contributing towards that industry average. Whereas when we look at just a spread of product EPDs, that's all it is. It's a spread of product EPDs with no weighting based on how much is actually being produced in the country, or in North America, I should say. So yes, that is the full question. And as far as what is in the EC3 tool, again, I think the 2025 CLF baselines will be incorporated into the EC3 tool over time as they're available and they have staff capacity to make the updates. The next question, Brooke and Rochelle, is from Susan Jarvis. This is a good one about imported products, and it's a little bit long, so if you can click on the Q&A, but I will read it out here. The question is, how are baselines established for primarily imported products like European glulam and mass timber? Could excluding non-North American manufacturers lead to an unrealistic or unattainable benchmark for the North American market?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we made the methodological decision to limit this to North American manufacturing, and we absolutely recognize that that is different than a consumption-based geography that we could have applied. Um, and so part of that is just about PCRs. PCRs provide some guardrails for comparability. And so generally, we look at a North American PCR, and those are mostly North American produced products that use that North American PCR, although there are some exceptions um, in either direction. And and it's also about our staff time availability in terms of where we can focus our efforts. And so focusing on North American manufacturing is one way to be more focused. Um, and I think as the question kind of alludes to, there's some product types where that's probably minimally relevant or not at all relevant, some where it's very relevant and some in the middle. And so I would say if someone's using this um, a baseline in a program, and most of the products or many of the products are typically coming from outside of North America, and their GWP profile is quite different. That might be a case where one would need to adapt how the program implements the baseline. So I think we hope for some flexibility in terms of how project teams, programs, et cetera, implement the baselines. I'll invite you to add to that, Jordan, if you would like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think project teams can still be using North American baselines to help evaluate products that are imported, especially if they're using the same product category rule. If those imported products are using a North American product category rule and providing an EPD, then that would be comparable to the CLF North American baseline. So at a project scale, you still might be able to use the baselines to do more of a consumption-based approach. And that's one of the other things that we find across the country is that people's markets change dramatically based on where you are in North America. So the idea of doing a consumption-based baseline for all of North America is quite a large project considering the different places that all the materials come from around the world. So at the moment, we're focused on production-based baselines for North America, but do believe they can still be useful at the project scale for imported products. All right. So I'm looking at the time here. We have another couple minutes. There's one from Jamie. I read this. Were there any product leading items in GWP terms which were markedly worse than their peers and other aspects like acidification? Was there anecdotal concern or tunnel vision if we chased GWP over other factors?
Ah, the second part may be, and we 100% acknowledge that, and as Rochelle pointed out in one of the initial slides, our focus here is on embodied carbon. I think there's good reason to be focused on embodied carbon. I also agree with, I think, is the sentiment of that question that we don't want to be only focused on that generally, but for this project, our focus is on carbon. So we did not look at other impact categories, and that would be outside of our scope, but nonetheless important.
Thanks, Brooke. And then I think the last question I'll tee up is it says which EPDs you use for Canadian materials. So um, maybe I'll interpret this as asking, are there Canadian specific values that are referenced in the CLF 2025 baselines?
Yes, so most of our baseline values are aimed to represent all of North America. We have some that are regional, as I mentioned, some that are national. So, for example, there are, and it mostly depends on what data we have. So, for example, there is a U.S. Portland Cement Association (PCA) in their industry average EPDs for cement produced in the U.S., and there are separate cement industry average EPDs for Canada. Similar for ready-mix concrete, as I mentioned in this presentation. Similar for concrete masonry units, there are different industry average EPDs for those in Canada versus the US. For some structural steel, that is also the case. There are industry average EPDs specific to Canada, and we show them in our report. Those are the ones I can think of. And was there another part of that question I missed?
There is not. That is everything. And that also brings us to the top of the hour here. So I just wanted to thank especially Brooke and Rochelle for a great presentation and really good work on this report. Thank you all for attending the webinar. It's so valuable for us to hear feedback about how you're using the baselines, which parts are most useful to you. If you have any further questions that weren't answered today, please feel free to reach out to Brooke and Rochelle, whose emails are listed on the slide here. And again, thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Yeah, so much.